B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yiruvin Daf Samach Daled. We're going to start about 10 lines from the bottom of Daf Samach Gimel Omid Beis. And we're going back now to our sugya of Yiruvei Chatzeros and Shitufei Muvois, that in order to have a valid Eruv, there must be that all the people, all the residents within the Chotza and Eruv are all joining into the Eruv. And if there's even a single goy amongst them, he can destroy the entire Eruv and restrict all the Yisraelim who are there from carrying to and from the Chotzer and Mavoi. Says the Gemara, Hahu Mavoya, there was this Mavoi, the Havadayer ba Lachmon Baristak. There was a guy whose name was Lachmon Baristak, and he was living in that Mavoi, in one of the Chatzeros of that Mavoi. Omruloi. So the Yisraelim there, the Jewish people within that Mavoi, said to this guy, Oiger lon Roshusach, rent out to us your rights in the Chotza, or in the Mavoi, and that way we'll all be able to carry to and from the Mavoi. Loi Oiger lahu, the guy refused to rent out his part in the Mavoi to the Yisrael. Also, Amrulei Abaya, they came to Abaya and said, we have a problem, we have a Mavoi, but we have a guy that does not want to rent us his portion. What do we do? Omar Luhus, Abai told them, Zilu betilu rushusaichu legabe chad. We have another solution here. We'll remember that we saw in our Mishnah, the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is when there's just one Yisrael and one goy, there's no issue there. Then we just look at the goy's residence as a stable, and everything, the Chotzer belongs to the Yisrael, and the Yisrael can carry from his home to the Chotzer and vice versa. The problem is, if there's two or more Yisraelim, then the Chachomim made their gezerah that we have to assume and we have to look at the residence of the Goy as if it's a residence, and therefore the Chotzer will belong not only to the Yisrael but also to the residence of the Goy, and carrying from the bias of the Yisrael to the Chotzer that's got a number of residents, that's a problem. Over here we have a number of Yisraelim. So what we're going to do? Sabaya says that all of you should relinquish your rights to the Chotzer, to the Mavoi, and to one of the people. And then indeed Rashi says the other people will not be able to carry from their homes into the Chotzer. But that one person to whom all the others have relinquished their rights to can carry from his home to the Mavoi. And anything that's in the Mavoi is allowed to be carried in the Mavoi by anybody, and at least you've gained that. Havele yochid b'mokim nochri. If all of you relinquish your rights to any one of you, then as far as residence is concerned, we look at it as if there's just the goy and this one person who's the only residence, because everybody else has relinquished their rights to the Mavoi. And then it's considered as one Yisrael with one goy, and then the guy does not get in our way. If you have a single Yisrael with a guy, then he is not restricted and he's allowed to carry from his home to the Chotzer. Omrule. So they asked Abaya, Midi hu taima. We already said before that technically speaking, a guy is just like a stable, and therefore he's not considered a residence at all. Why do we look at the goy as if he is a residence, and being a second residence restricts the Yisrael from carrying to the Chotzer? Because we don't want people to live with goyim. And even though Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says a single Yid would not live with a goy, and therefore even if circumstances forced him to do that, it's very uncommon, and therefore the Chachomim did not make a gzeira. But when you have two or more Yisraelim living together with the Goy, the Chachomim made their decree to assume that the Goy's Rishus is considered a Rishus in order to prevent the Yisrael from living close to the Goy. Here you have a situation with two or more Yisrael, and the Goy is getting in the way of the Eruv, which is what we wanted. We want the Yisraelim to move away from there. And now you're making a solution by saying, let's take all the Yisrael and find some way of, so to speak, turning them into a single entity, and then there will not be an issue. But the whole reason that the Chachomim made their decree was that there should be an issue. Midi or timer. What's the reason that we consider the Goy's Rishus as being a Rishus? Is Elo Deloi Shchicha. That means the only reason that we considered the goy as a reshus when there was 2 or more Yisraelim, and we did not consider a goy's reshus a reshus when there's just one Yisrael living there, is because it's not common for there to be one Yisrael. Here you have many Yisraelim living together, and so turning them, so to speak, into one by all the others relinquishing their rights to the Mavui, to this one, what have you gained? The Chachamim said, if there's more than one of you, we do not want you living near the goy, and we want the goy's reshus to get in the way of your eruv. So finding a solution like this has gone behind the backs of and against the idea of what the Chachamim said. So Amaluhu Sabai answered them as follows. He says, you're right, that since it's common for 2 Yisraelim to live with a goy, and we didn't want that, therefore we try and make it difficult under normal circumstances. But in the same way that a single Yisrael is not a normal circumstance, and therefore he's not bothered by the goy, so too, Kol bitulei reshusaihu gabechad, the concept of all the people relinquishing their rights to the Mavui, to any one of the residents, is also milsa de leishchichi, it's an unusual occurrence, or milsa de leishchicha legozru barabonon. And therefore, in this case too, the Chachamim said, since it's very uncommon for all the people to relinquish their rights to any one of them, therefore, the Chachamim, if they did do that, the Chachamim did not say that there would be a problem with that, and that's what Abaya said, that was the solution they could use if none other could be found. Ozal Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yeshua. Omro l'shmaita kamei de Rava. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, went and told over to Rava what had just transpired and what Abaya had said, that if you have 2 Yisrael and 1 goy, and the goy does not want to rent his part to the Yisrael, then the Yisraelim between themselves should use bittul, where they should all relinquish their rights to one of them, and that way it's considered like 1 Yisrael with 1 goy, and then the goy will not restrict whatever use is allowed to be used under those circumstances in the Mavui. Omerli, so Rava said to him, Im Kain, look, if you're going to follow Abaya's advice, bitalto teiras eruv me'oisei Mavui, then from that Mavui, you've taken away the whole concept of eruv, because once a person relinquishes, once all the people relinquish their rights to just one of the people, then you don't need an eruv anymore. The concept of an eruv is when you have a number of different entities and they're all merging and blending into one by putting food into one of the homes. If they all relinquish their rights, then there's no concept of eruv. And what you've done is, you've destroyed the whole concept of eruv in this mavui. Answers the Gemara, the Ma'aravi. Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yeshua said that in this mavui, even though an eruv itself does not help if there's a goy there, unless they can rent the part of the rights of the goy from the goy. In this case, the goy was not prepared to do that, and in all likelihood he would not be prepared to do it ever in the future. So eruv itself doesn't work. And that's why Abaya said the only thing that can work is if we can turn all the Yisraelim into a single Yisrael, that by all the others relinquishing their rights to this Yisrael. But in order not to forget the concept of eruv, in order that in this mavui they should know that even though they can all carry in the eruv, and they can carry from the home of this one individual to whom they've all relinquished their rights from his home into the chotza, and vice versa, without an eruv, that people shouldn't think that you don't need an eruv, and then they're going to come and carry even when 1 week where they do not all relinquish their rights to this one person. In order to avoid that, ma'arvi, they're going to make a useless eruv, just so that everybody should know that there is a concept of eruv, and one cannot carry under normal circumstances without an eruv. So Rava says that won't be good enough. People will say that you can use the concept of eruv even when there's a goy there. And we know that's not true. So you can't just make an eruv so that people should remember the concept of eruv if you're actually giving an incorrect message to people that eruv works. So Rav Huna answered him, De machruzinon, we're going to publicly proclaim to everybody that we're only making the eruv, that you should all remember that you're not allowed to carry under normal circumstances without an eruv, but you should all know that eruv is invalid, it's not effective, and and therefore you cannot carry from all the homes of the people who have relinquished their rights to the Mavoi. They cannot carry from their homes into the Mavoi. So everybody will know that the Eruv is not valid, and there'll be no misunderstanding. So Rava said, what about the children? What about the next generation? What about all those that don't hear this proclamation and all they see is that you're making an Eruv and you're carrying? And there may be those weeks that you're going to forget to all of you relinquish your rights to this one person, and again we're going to have an issue with it. Elo Omar Rava, so Rava said we have to find another solution. Abaya's solution is not so convenient. Leizel chad minayu likariv le, says one of the Israelim should get friendly with this guy. V'lishel minei duchta, and at some point when the relationship is built up, he should try and get permission from the guy to actually use his section or his rashus in the mavui, in the chotzer. He should be allowed to use the guy's chotzer to put some things down there. V'leinach beimidi, and he will then store some things. The Yisrael will store some things in the chotzer of the guy. Then he'll be similar to an employee. There are two different types of employees. There's an employee called a sochir, which is an employee for the whole year. There's an employee called lekitu, a lokit, which means that he's only employed for certain seasons of the year when he's needed in the fields. Either way, what typically defines, or what's typical in the case of sochir, is that the guy actually allows these workers, these employees, to use his rashus. So if you can work up a relationship with the guy that he lets you use his chotzer, it will be similar to sochir v'lokit, who are normally allowed to use the chotzer of their goy employer. V'omer Yehuda Mashmuel, afilu schirei v'afilu lekitoi noisen eiruvoi v'dayoi. In the event that you have a goy who has with him an employee, a Yisrael, and the employee has permission to use the chotzer of the goy, then if you want to make an eruv and the goy is an issue, then this employee who has permission to use part of the chotzer of the goy, he can just join an eruv, like with any other eruv. So all the Israelim will make a regular eruv. This employee or this person who has permission to use the chotzer of the goy will also join the eruv, and that way the rashus, the residence of the goy, has, so to speak, joined the eruv via the Yisrael who's allowed to use his residence, and v'dayu, that's enough, that's sufficient. So Rava said, try and work that out. Continues the Gemara. Omar le Abaye Rav Yosef. Abaye asked Rav Yosef, Hoyu shom chamisha schiroi v'chamisha lekitoi. What happens if a goy employer has 5 employees with the status of schiru, and 5 employees with the status of lekitu, and mahu, and they're all allowed to use his chotzer, and so to speak, the goy is sharing his own residence with these 10 Yisraelim, 5 of which are schiras, 5 of which are lekitu. Obviously, the number doesn't have to be 5; it's just a number that is commonly picked here. Then the question is, mahu, is it enough for any one of them to join the eruv? And then, so to speak, the residence of the goy is part of the eruv, and everybody can carry as one would with a good eruv? Or do we say no? Since there are 10 employees there, each and every one of these employees has to join the eruv. Omar le, so Rav Yosef answered back to Abaya, Im omru schilu ulekitu lahokil. If they use this concept of being an employee of a goy for a leniency, where normally if the goy has a residence without Jewish employees, then he restricts the whole eruv, and then he has to rent his part to the Yisrael, and if he doesn't want to, we have no other healthy solution. And we said that being an employee of this goy helps us be lenient and somehow incorporates the residence of the goy via this Yisrael into the eruv of the other Yisrael, and then everybody can carry in the chotzer and or eruv based on this, and or mavui based on this eruv. But yoimru schiru lekitu lahachmir. But does anybody suggest that having the 10 employees, if a goy has 10 employees, that you need to be stringent and have to have all 10 of them to join in the eruv? That's very not probable. It makes sense that if one of the employees makes the eruv, that's enough as far as the Goy's residence is concerned, the fact that there's another 9 employees in the residence of the Goy, that doesn't mean, we do not look at it as if there are 9 residents of the Chotzer that have not joined the Eruv, because they are just employees. It's not their homes. If you had these 10 people each owning homes, of course all 10 will have to join the Eruv. But here we only consider an employee as being, so to speak, having an ownership in the residence of the Goy, only to allow that residence to join the Eruv. But we don't see the fact that there's employees, that there's multiple employees to the Goy. We do not see them as all, so to speak, owning their own residence, and they all have to join the Eruv. It's sufficient for one of them to join the Eruv. Continues the Gemara Gufa. We learnt before, Omer of Yehuda Mashmuel, afilu schiroi v'afilu lekitoi, even an employee who's employed by the Goy and is allowed to use part of the residence of the Goy, noisin eruvoi, he can share, he can be part of the Eruv, v'dayoi, and that's enough, and the fact that the residence proper belongs to the Goy no longer restricts the Eruv. Omer of Nachman, Kamo ma'al yohai shmaita, how amazing, how excellent, how good, how valuable is this statement. Omer Rav Yehuda Mashmuel. Rav Yehuda Mashmuel said another halacha. Shosor revius yain. If somebody drank a revius of wine, al yoira, he should not be a dayan. He should not render any legal decisions. Somebody who's under the influence of wine cannot think so straight. Omer Rav Nachman. When Rav Nachman heard this halacha, he said, Lo ma'al yahoshmaitza. No, this statement, almost so to speak in contrast to the previous one, this one is not so ma'alya, it's not such a good statement. Doha'anov, for talking about himself, Rav Nachman said, Kol kama deloisha sina reviasa dechamrasa, as long as I did not drink a revius of wine, lo yitzilo datoi, my mind is not clear. I actually need wine to clear my mind. Wine, in my mind, and the Ritva says that Rav Nachman assumed that many people were of the same constitution as he was, that not drinking wine actually contributes to a lack of clarity. Omali Rava. Rava now said to Rav Nachman, and he wasn't now discussing whether Rav Nachman's statement was right or wrong, whether wine is good or bad for a clear mind. He says, "My tama omar mar hochi." There's an issue with the way that you expressed yourself, to verbalize and say this Torah statement, this halachic statement is ma'al yasa, is good, is special, and this one isn't. That's an issue. Ha'omer Rav Acha bar Chanina. Rav Acha bar Chanina said, Ma'udichsiv, it says in the Pasuk, V'roi'eh, somebody who befriends zoinos, prostitutes, Ye'abeit hoim, he's going to lose his wealth. That's the literal translation of the Pasuk. Now the word zoinos, that as in literally translated as prostitutes, as in znus, but it can split up the word zoinos as in zu no. This one is nice. This one is beautiful. Anyone who says that this statement, halachic statement or Torah statement, is beautiful, and this statement is not beautiful, he is called, so to speak, he is alluded to in the pasuk of ro'eh zoinos, because he's choosing to say zu no, and ma'abed hoino shel Torah. Then the honor of Torah is, he's going to lose the honor of Torah, and Rashi says he's going to end up forgetting his learning. Omaleh of Nachman said, Hodrubi, you're right, and I take that back, and I'm not going to use such an expression in the future. And now the Gemara is going to digress to a sugya which is going to take us for a while, regarding the influence of wine when it comes to ruling halachas, when it comes to davening. Let's see the Gemara. Omar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Shosui al Yispalil. Somebody who drank wine should not daven. And if he did daven, tefillah tefillah. Nonetheless, his tefillah is considered a valid tefillah. Shikar, if somebody not only drank wine, but is actually drunk, he's intoxicated by wine, al yispalil, he should not daven. That goes without saying. Even if you just drank wine and did not become drunk, you're not allowed to daven. But in this case, if he did daven, tefillah to'eva, his tefillahs are an abomination and they are not accepted. Says the Gemara, Heicha dami shasui v'heicha dami shikir. What defines drinking? What defines being intoxicated? Says the Gemara, Ki hader b'Abba bar Shumni v'Rev Menashe bar Yirmiyah megifti. There were these two chachomim. Hava kamifter mehadodi. They separated paths from each other. They took leave of each other. Amavra de Nahar Yofti, at the bridge of the river called Yofti. Amru, they said to each other, Kol chad minon, let each of us, leimo milsa deloi shemir lechavrei. Let's say some Torah thought that is new to each other, that we haven't heard yet. The Omar Mora bar Ravuna, because Mora bar Ravuna said, Lo yiftar odom mechaveru, when a person takes leave from his friend, he shouldn't do so ela miteich dvar halacha, except he should only do so through the words of Torah. Shemiteich kach, by doing so, zochreyu, he will remember him. Pasach chad v'omar, so one of these two chachomim started and said as follows: Heicha dami shasui v'heicha dami shikar. Exactly the discussion we have now. What defines drinking? What defines intoxication? And he said as follows: Shasui kol sheyochel ledaber lifnei hamelech. Drinking, which is not considered intoxicated and drunk, is somebody that can still stand in front of a king and speak to the king. That means if the influence of alcohol is so little that he could still do that, then even though he should not daven, but if he did, his tefillah is considered a tefillah. Shikr, someone who is drunk, who's intoxicated, is kol she'eina yochel ledaber lifnei hamelech, anyone who's not capable of speaking straight and properly, appropriately to a king. And this is what we wanted to know before. We have the answer. But we're in the middle of the story there, on this bridge, that now Pasach Idoch v'Omar, the other Chacham, it's his turn to say a new halacha, Hamachzik b'nechse hager. And he said the following halacha: we know that a convert does not have any relatives, assuming he didn't get married and have children after he converted. So if a convert has possessions, and then the convert dies, then who inherits him? Anybody who comes to take his possessions and does a kinyan, does a valid act of acquiring those nechasim, then he's acquired those possessions. Hamachzik b'nechse hager, somebody who takes possession of the estates of a convert. Ma'yasu v'yiskaimu b'yodoi, since people wonder and they are amazed at, wow, this person with no effort whatsoever, he's just suddenly become a rich man, he suddenly inherited so many possessions, and he did nothing for it. All he did was, he claimed possession of something that a deceased convert had left over. And since people are going to wonder that, it could cause a person to have an ayin hara, and he could lose his possessions. So in order to safeguard his possessions, we want him to use part of this newly acquired possessions to do a mitzvah. So he says, what should a person do? What mitzvah should he do, and in order that the remaining possessions should stay comfortably and safely in his hands? He should buy a sefer Torah with some of the money. Omer Rav Sheshes says, Afilu bal b'nechsi ishtoi. If a woman passes away and she had possessions that she brought into the marriage, and the husband now inherits her, here too he suddenly acquired a tremendous amount of possession, or some possessions, however much it may be, without any effort. And again, people are going to eye him in wonderment and possibly cause an ayin hara. So this person also should do a mitzvah, buy a sefer Torah with part of the money that he's inherited. Rava says, even if somebody invested and he made a profit, it's worth his while protecting the profits he's made by investing part of it with a mitzvah, like buying a sefer Torah. Even if somebody just finds a lost object and it's got some substantial value, and again there could be an ayin hara, he should use part of the money in order to do a mitzvah, like buying a sefer Torah. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says you don't even have to buy a sefer Torah, which is very expensive, even though the sefer Torah is used by the tzibur, by the public. You don't need to go that far. Afilu kosav bu tefillin, even if you use some of the money to purchase some tefillin, and that's also a mitzvah, that way you will have secured the rest of the possessions from ayin hara damaging it. V'omer of Chonin v'yitemer of Chanina. Ma'ikra, where do we find such a concept that if a person is afraid whether he's going to take, whether possessions are going to stay in his hands or not, that he should do a mitzvah with it, and that way he can be guaranteed, hopefully, that what he has will stay with him. Dechsiv, it says in the pasuk, Vayidar Yisrael neder v'goymer, that Klal Yisrael, they made a vow, they made a promise, and they said that when they were going out to a war with Arad, then they said that, and after they were being threatened by those people, after Aaron HaKohen passed away, and the clouds that were protecting Klal Yisrael had dispersed, then they vowed that the spoils of those cities, they were going to be given to Hektish, they were going to be given to the Mishkan, and in that merit of that tzedakah that they gave, they hoped that they would be victorious and overcome the enemies, and indeed that's what happened. So you see that if you want to make sure that you can actually defeat the enemy, and you want to make sure that there should be no ayin hara, and what you have in your hands should stay in your hands, then you should be committed to do a mitzvah with it, and that way it will stay secure. Continues the Gemara. Omar Romi bar Abba. Romi bar Abba, he gave an added statement regarding somebody who had drunk some wine. Derech mil, if somebody travels the distance of 1 mil, we'll soon see it's talking about somebody who's walking, not that he's traveling in a carriage. V'sheino kolshehu, or any amount of sleep, mafigin es hayayin, it dissipates the effect of the wine. So even if somebody drank wine and then he could not daven, he should either go to sleep or walk a mil, and then he will be able to daven. Omer of Nachman, Omer Rabba Baravua, Lo yishonu elo sheshasa kadei revius. This is only true for somebody who only drank a single revius. Aval shasa yosem revius. If somebody drank more than a revius of wine, kol shekein shederech toyrdasoi v'sheino meshakartoi. Then the energy that's needed in order to walk a distance of a mil or more, not only is it not going to dissipate the influence of the alcohol, but the exertion is actually going to confuse him even more and cause him to be even less lucid in his mind. And added sleep is going to add slumberness and drunkenness to this person, and is not going to help him. So when we saw before that Romi bar Abba said that walking a mil or sleeping actually helps a person get rid of the influence of the alcohol, it's only if he drank not more than a revius. Asks the Gemara, derech mil mefigo hayayin, and so let's assume that he drank a revius. Is walking a mil going to be sufficient? V'otanya, this seems to contradict the brisa, and we're now going to learn quite a long brisa regarding these halachas. Ma'aseh b'Rabban Gamliel, there was an incident with Rabban Gamliel, shahaya roichev ala chamoir, he was riding on his donkey, v'hoya mahalich mi'akoi l'chziv, he was traveling from a place called Akoi to the place called Gziv. V'hoya Rabbi Loi mahalich acharov, and Rabbi Loi was following behind him. Motzo gluskin baderech, as they were traveling with their donkeys, Rabbi Gamliel noticed some loaves of bread on the road. Omar Loi, so Rabbi Gamliel said to Rabbi Loi, Iloi, Tul gluskin min haderech. Take the loaves, do not leave the loaves on the streets, just pass them by, take them with you. Motza nochri echad. At some point later, as they were traveling, Rabbi Gamliel met a goy. Omar Loi. Rabbi Gamliel said again to Rabbi Loi, Mavgoy. He didn't say to Rabbi Loi, sorry, he said to this goy, who his name happened to have been Mavgoy, Goy, Mavgoy, come here. Tul gluskin alolu meiloi. Take these loaves of bread from Eloi. Nitfa lo Rav Eloi. After giving the bread to this goy, Rav Eloi he approached this goy. Omar Eloi, and he said to him, Mehechon ata? Where are you from? Omar Eloi me'ayori shel burgenin. This guy said that I live in the towns of the huts. Omar shemcha. Rav Eloi asked him, what's your name? He said, Mavgoy shmeini. My name is Mavgoy, as Rabbi Gamliel said before. Klumi hikircho Rabbi Gamliel me'olam. Rabbi Eloi asked this guy, till this point, did you ever meet Rabban Gamliel? Did he know you? That he should have had reason to know your name? Omar loy. So the guy said to Rabbi loy, until this point I've never met Rabban Gamliel. At that point learnt Shakivin Rabban Gamliel Baruch HaKodesh, that Rabban Gamliel had Ruach HaKodesh, that he had some divine inspiration, that he understood, he had this intuition that this guy's name was Mavgoi. At that point, three halach, the Bryce is going to continue soon with the incident, but at this point, so far, there's three things that can be learnt from what transpired. Number one, lomadnu she'ein mavirin al oichlin. Rabbi Gamliel taught Rabbi Loi that when you pass by bread, don't just pass it by. You should pick up the bread from the ground. Number two, what else did we learn? Why didn't Rav Gamliel allow Rabbi Loi to eat the bread? Why did he insist that Rabbi Loi gives the bread to a goy? And the answer is because we follow the majority of travelers on this road, and since the majority of travelers on this road are goyim, we assume it's bread baked by a goy. Bread baked by a goy should not be eaten by a Yisrael. 3. What else did we learn? It was not long after Pesach. And as we saw, number 2, that we assume that this bread belonged to a goy. So we assume that this bread was actually chometz on Pesach, it belonged to a goy. And Rabbi Gamliel was telling us that one is allowed to derive benefit from chometz that belonged to a goy on Pesach. You can't derive benefit on Pesach from it, but after Pesach you can derive benefit from it. Giving a gift to a goy is a backhanded way of deriving benefits, because whenever you give somebody a gift, they feel the need to reciprocate. And the fact that Rabbi Gamliel allowed Rabbi Loi to give the bread to this goy, this mavgoy, even though this mavgoy would then be returning a favor to Rabbi Loi, and that would be called deriving benefit, we see from here that one's allowed to derive benefit after Pesach from chometz that belong to a goy on Pesach. So now the Brisa continues with the story, the incident. Kivan she'egia lechziv, when Reb Gamliel arrived at the place called Kziv, bo echad lishel dal nidrei, somebody approached him and said, I made a vow, and I would like you to annul that vow. Omar lezeh she'imoi. So Gamliel asked Rav Loi, who was with him, Klum shatinu revius yain ho'italki? Did we drink while we were traveling? Did we drink a revius of extra strong wine, Italian wine? Omar Loi, Rav Loi said to him, Hin, yes, we drank a revius of this strong wine. Imkein yitay lacharenu al sheyofig yeinoi. Rav Gamliel said to this person who wanted his vow annulled, he says, come and follow us, walk behind us or follow us until we've traveled far enough that the influence of the wine is no longer affecting our lucidity. Because in order to annul a vow, it's a type of din Torah. It needs certain amount of brain and concentration and understanding. We'll soon see why. And since we've drunk this wine, we cannot rely on the lucidity of our minds. Wait until this is dissipated. He followed Reb Gamliel and Rabbi Loi 3 mil after until he reached some rocky heights. When he reached the rocky heights, Reb Gamliel descended, he climbed down from the donkey, and he wrapped himself in his cloak, which is what the Dayanim would often do in order to preserve their concentration when dealing with a case. V'yoshav, and he would sit down. V'hitir lo nidroi, and he annulled this person's vow. So the Bryce is now telling us, V'harbe dvarim lamadnu ba'isei shah. From that incident, we learnt many halachas. Number 1, lamadnu shervius yain o italki mashakir. We learnt that drinking a revius of wine intoxicates a person. And therefore, Gamliel felt that he could not rule on the case whilst under the influence of that wine. V'lomadnu shikar al yaira. We learnt another halacha. Not only did we learn that a revius of Italian wine has the ability to intoxicate somebody, we learnt that somebody who's intoxicated is not allowed to render any legal decisions. Number 3, what else did we learn? V'lomadnu shederech, we learned that traveling mefigoes hayayin, it removes the effects of the wine, the intoxicated effects of the wine. V'lomadnu, number 4, we learnt she'ein mefirin nedorim, that when you are annulling a vow, you should not do it loy rochuv, not whilst you're riding. He was riding on a donkey. He got off his donkey. V'loy mahalich, nor walking. V'loy oimed, and not even standing. Elo yeshiv, you should only annul this vow when you're sitting down. So that's what we saw in the Brisa. Now the Gemara is stepping in and saying, Ktonimius. What did we learn from here? Shloishes milin, that in order to dissipate the influence of the alcohol, you have to go 3 mil. And this seems to contradict what Rami bar Abba said, that traveling just 1 mil is sufficient. Answers the Gemara, Shani yaino italki. Italian wine, being that it's even stronger than regular wine, as we saw before, then the mashakir tfei, it's got an even stronger ability to intoxicate somebody, and in order to dissipate that influence of the alcohol, you have to travel not 1 mil, but 3 mil. Asks the Gemara of Omer of Nachman, Omer Rabba Baravua, Lo yishonu elo sheshasa revius. Did we not say before that walking a mil is only sufficient if you drank just a revius? If you drank more than a revius, then the influence of the alcohol is such in the person's body that walking is actually going to aggravate his lack of clarity. If so, if this Italian wine is even stronger than normal wine, even though you drank just a revius, but the alcohol should have an effect similar to drinking more than a revius of regular wine, so why does traveling along the way help at all? It should be that it should be making his mind even less clear, not clearing his mind. We saw that if somebody drinks more than a revius of regular wine, even more so, traveling on the road will disturb him, and the sleep will increase his feelings of intoxication. So over here, drinking even just a revius of Italian wine, traveling should not have dissipated his intoxication. Answers the Gemara, Rochov Shani. A person who's walking, the exertion of the walking will actually aggravate his mind even more. But since Reb Gamliel, he was not walking, he was riding. We saw he was riding on his donkey, and which is much less exertion. So somebody who's riding, then traveling along the way will not aggravate it. He needed, at this point we assume he needed 3 mil, because the wine was much stronger than regular wine. But traveling actually did help him in the same way as walking would have helped for regular wine. 1 mil, so traveling or walking 3 mil for this wine, or not walking, but traveling, riding 3 mil for this stronger wine was enough. Says the Gemara, Hashta da osis lahachi. Now that you've come to this understanding that you're differentiating between walking and riding, Rami bar Abba nami lo ikashya. Let's go back to our original question. Rami bar Abba said that 1 mil is sufficient. In the Brisa we saw that 3 mil is what we need. So we said before, the reason you need 3 mil is because the wine, the Italian wine, was stronger than regular wine. Now the Gemara says no. It could be that Rami bar Abba, who said that 1 mil is enough, is talking about somebody who's actually walking himself up to revius. And when do you need 3 mil is if somebody is riding. Somebody who's riding, 1 mil is not enough. You need 3 mil. L'Rami bar Abba nami lo ikashya rochuv shani. When you're traveling, you need 3 mil, and then that would be true for any wine, not just for this wine, not just for this Italian wine. If for regular wine, walking 1 mil is enough, and traveling, riding, you would need 3 mil. Says the Gemara, Eini. We saw before that one of the halachas we learnt in the Brisa from Rebbe Gamliel is that when you annul a vow, you have to sit down. Is that true? V'omer of Nachman said, Mefirim nedarim, one is allowed to annul a vow, bein mahalich, either walking, or bein oimed, or standing, or bein rochuv, or riding. You don't need to be sitting down. And that seems to contradict what we saw from Rebbe Gamliel. Answers the Gemara, Tanoihi. There's actually dependent on a machlokas tanoim. There's one Tana who holds poischin becharota. Before a chacham is allowed to annul a vow, you have to actually find some grounds to actually regret having made that vow. You have to find some circumstance where you can say, had I known that, ... then I would never have made the vow. And once you regret the vow, then the vow undoes itself. But other opinion holds that in poischin becharota, you do not need to find a regret before a chacham can annul a vow. So if you need to search for a regret and decide whether any particular regret, whether it's a strong enough pesach, an opening to allow us to annul the vow or not, that's similar to making a legal ruling. Rabbi Gamliel held, since I need to do that, I cannot be standing, walking, riding, I have to be sitting down with absolute and maximum clarity. However, when Rav Nachman said that you can annul a vow in any state you want, he held that you don't need any great concentration, and even without an opening of regret, one can annul a vow, and therefore one does not need to sit down. We see that indeed Reb Gamliel helped this person find an opening of regret. What opening of regret did Reb Gamliel help this person in order to then be able to annul his vow? So Reb Gamliel said to him as follows, that there's a pasuk, the pasuk says, Yesh boite kamad kerois. There is someone whose speech damages like the piercing of a sword. Kamad kerois cherev, like the piercings of a sword. Ulashoin chachomim, but the language, the tongue of the chachomim, marpe, it can actually heal. So Gamliel explained to the person, what do we understand in this pasuk? Kol ha-boite, anyone who declares a vow, ro'ui, he is deserving to be killed. L'doikrei b'cherev, he's deserving to be pierced by a sword. Elo shelashein chachomim marpe, but he can still be helped by annulling the vow before he actually transgresses the vow. He can help himself by coming to a chacham, and this l'shein chachomim marpe, the wise person, this chacham can heal the effects of the vow by annulling the vow. So Reb Gamliel asked this person, had you known that making a vow is punishable, could be punishable by death, would you have made such a vow? The person said, of course not. So Reb Gamliel says that means you regret having made the vow. If you regret having made the vow, he then annulled the vow for this person. Continues the Gemara, Omar Mar, we learnt in the Brisa, Ve'ein ma'avirin ala oichlin. We saw from the fact that Reb Gamliel stopped Rabbi Eloi and told him to pick up the bread, that we know from there that you shouldn't just walk past some bread on the floor and leave it on the floor. Omar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Reb Shimon bar Yochai, lo yishanu ela b'doros harishonim. This is only true in early generations. She'ein b'nos Yisrael prutzos b'kshafim. Then the Jewish girls, the Jewish daughters, they were not so open, they were not so porut to sorcery. But in the later generations, she'b'nos Yisrael prutzos b'kshafim, that the Jewish daughters, they commonly were open to sorcery. Ma'avirin, just walk past the loaves of bread and leave it there, because one of the ways that they would cause their spells and do their sorcery is using a loaf of bread, that people would walk over it and then they would get harmed. Tana, we learnt in a brisa, shleimin mavirin, that indeed if you see a whole loaf of bread on the floor, mavirin, you should walk past it, because there's the risk of it being affected by the sorcery of these daughters of Yisrael. Ptitin ein mavirin. However, if it's just pieces, crumbs or pieces of bread, then it was not common to use that for sorcery, and therefore you should pick them up and you should not walk past them. Asks the Gemara, Omar Rav Asi Rav Ashi, v'ptitin lo yovdon. Is it true that sorcery was not done on pieces of bread, only on whole loaves of bread? V'oksiv, does it not say in the pasuk, v'techalelena oisi el ami, and you desecrate me before my nation, b'sha'alei sa'irim, with handfuls of barley, or b'psoisei lechem, and with pieces of bread, saying that you are practicing sorcery. It seems to be that you're practicing sorcery being aided by handfuls of barley and pieces of bread, and you are using this sorcery to cause the Klal Yisrael to move away from Hashem. So you see clearly that there's ptoisei lechem, which is bread crumbs or pieces of bread that are used for sorcery. So this seems to contradict what we saw before, that only shleimim mavirin, psisin ein mavirin. Answers the Gemara, to shokli ba'agrayu. What the pasuk actually means is that these sorcerers or sorceresses, what they were doing, they were taking pieces of bread as payment, and then they would do their sorcery using either whole loaves or other objects and items. But they didn't actually use those pieces of bread, the piece of bread that were given to them as payment. They were not the items that were used for the sorcery itself, and therefore what we said before is intact, that we only need to be concerned about sorcery if you see a whole loaf. But if you see just pieces or crumbs or pieces of a loaf, then there's no problem of sorcery. And that's the end of this sugya. And that's what it means, the shokli ba'agrayu. They only took it as payment. And in Mirz Hashem, in the next Gemara, we're going to continue with the influences of wine that we started with before.